Susa, 324 BC. Alexander the Great has organized what he calls the marriage of East and West, a mass wedding where 10,000 of his Macedonian soldiers will marry Persian women in a single ceremony. Greek historians will celebrate this as visionary multiculturalism, proof of Alexander's enlightened belief in unity between peoples. But look at the women's faces. These aren't joyful brides. They're captured Persian women, many of noble birth, being mass married to foreign soldiers who conquered their cities, killed their fathers and brothers, destroyed their civilization. The ceremony is compulsory for the women. Refusal means death or sale to brothels. Compliance means becoming a Macedonian soldier's wife, bearing children who'll be raised Greek, forgetting you were ever Persian. Princess Stateira II stands in the front row. Alexander himself has chosen her as one of his wives. She's daughter of the defeated Persian king Darius III. This is presented as honor, as Alexander embracing Persian royalty as equals. But Stateira understands the truth. She's a trophy, living proof that Persia has been so thoroughly conquered that even their princesses now belong to Macedonian kings. Behind her stand 10,000 Persian women, all captured over years of Macedonian campaigning. They wear Greek-style wedding dresses, their Persian clothing forbidden. They'll take Greek names, their Persian names erased. They'll worship Greek gods, their Persian faith suppressed. The marriage is systematic cultural genocide disguised as romance. Alexander gives a speech about unity and brotherhood between Greeks and Persians. He promises these marriages will heal the wounds of war, create a new hybrid civilization that combines the best of both peoples. What he doesn't mention is that this hybrid will speak Greek, worship Greek gods, follow Greek customs. The fusion is entirely one-directional, Persians becoming Greek, never Greeks becoming Persian. This mass wedding represents the culmination of 11 years of systematic exploitation of Persian women, tens of thousands captured, enslaved, bred to produce children who would be raised Macedonian, while their mothers watched silently, forbidden from teaching them their heritage. History remembers this as Alexander's enlightened vision. The Persian women who lived through it knew better. Before we expose the systematic brutality behind Alexander's greatness, if you're interested in how history sanitizes conquest through romantic narratives, hit that like button and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from. It's powerful how we're globally connected by our need to understand how empires weaponized women's bodies, while historians called it civilization. The systematic exploitation of Persian women began not at Susa's mass wedding in 324 BC, but 11 years earlier when Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia in 334 BC with 48,000 troops. From the first conquered city, Macedonian armies established patterns that would repeat across the Persian Empire. The Battle of Granicus River in May 334 BC was Alexander's first major victory over Persian forces. After crushing the Persian cavalry, his army moved into nearby cities that had supported the Persians. The city of Zellia opened its gates in surrender, hoping for mercy. What followed established the template for Macedonian conquest. Macedonian soldiers systematically separated women from the general population. Fighting age men were executed or enslaved for hard labor. Elderly and young children were released, no value, but women aged 12-40 were valuable, and the selection process began immediately. Officers evaluated them for beauty, nobility, and age, categorizing them for different purposes. A Persian woman named Roxana, not the famous one Alexander would later marry, experienced this first selection. She was 19, from a wealthy merchant family in Zellia, educated in Persian and some Greek. Macedonian officers noted her education and appearance, marking her as officer quality. She'd be claimed by a senior officer rather than distributed to common soldiers. The legal framework for this systematic capture was clear in Macedonian military tradition. Women captured in cities that resisted were considered spoils of war, property to be distributed among soldiers based on rank and contribution to victory. Alexander's army had detailed regulations about distribution of captured property, including explicit categories for captured women. High-ranking officers got first choice of noble and beautiful women. Mid-ranking officers received next tier. Common soldiers received shares based on unit performance. Some women were set aside for sale in slave markets. The army needed cash, and beautiful Persian women commanded premium prices in Greek markets. The system was organized, documented, and legal under Macedonian military law. The siege of Halicarnassus, later in 334 BC, demonstrated the scale this system would achieve. When the city fell after brutal fighting, approximately 2,000 women were captured. Ancient sources document that these women were distributed among the troops, with notable noble women reserved for Alexander's personal inspection. This meant systematic rape, disguised as military reward, made legal through conquest. The psychological impact on Persian women was immediate and devastating. They watched their cities conquered, their male relatives killed, their world destroyed, and then they themselves became property of the destroyers. The trauma compounded because Macedonian soldiers celebrated their victories, treating captured women as prizes, while the women grieved everything they'd lost. Alexander himself set the pattern by taking Persian concubines from the earliest conquests. He understood that controlling women from defeated cultures demonstrated total victory. You'd conquered not just the territory, but the people themselves. His personal example gave permission for every Macedonian soldier to view Persian women as legitimate spoils rather than human beings deserving protection. The siege of Tyre in 332 BC became one of Alexander's most celebrated military achievements, a 7-month siege of an island fortress city that seemed impregnable. But what happened to Tyre's women after conquest reveals the brutality behind Alexander's legendary tactics. Tyre resisted Alexander because its people believed their island fortress was invulnerable. The city was located on an island half a mile offshore, protected by high walls and supplied by sea. Previous besiegers had failed for centuries, but Alexander built a causeway from mainland to island, constructed siege towers, and eventually broke through after months of fighting. The cost of this prolonged resistance was paid primarily by Tyrian women. Ancient sources report that when the city finally fell, Alexander's rage at the lengthy siege resulted in systematic massacre and enslavement. Approximately 8,000 fighting men were executed. Another 30,000 people, mostly women and children, were sold into slavery. But before the mass enslavement, selection occurred. Macedonian officers entered the city during the sack and identified noble women and girls for special treatment. These weren't sent to slave markets. They were claimed directly by officers and Alexander himself. The most beautiful were reserved as personal concubines, others were distributed as rewards to soldiers who distinguished themselves during the siege. A Phoenician woman named Berenice, age 24, was among Tyre's noble class. Her father had been a wealthy merchant and city councilor, executed when the city fell. She was categorized as command tent quality and brought before Alexander himself. He evaluated her personally, then assigned her to one of his generals, Perdiccas. This wasn't negotiation or choice, it was transfer of property from one owner to another. The fate of common Tyrian women was systematic enslavement. They were loaded onto ships and transported to slave markets across the Greek world. Athens, Corinth, Rhodes, Syracuse. The markets were flooded with Tyrian captives, temporarily depressing slave prices because supply exceeded demand. Records indicate some women sold for as little as 200 drachmas, extremely low, indicating market oversaturation from mass enslavement. The psychological warfare of this selective treatment was calculated. By making examples of women from resistant cities, Alexander sent messages to other Persian cities: surrender immediately, and your women might be treated better. Resist, and they'll face systematic enslavement. It was terrorism through gendered violence, making women's bodies into warnings that influenced military decisions. The children born from Tyre's conquest represented the first generation of Alexander's fusion policy. Macedonian soldiers who'd received Tyrian women as spoils fathered children who were legally Macedonian, regardless of mother's status. These children grew up speaking Greek, worshiping Greek gods, trained in Macedonian military traditions. Their mother's Phoenician heritage was systematically erased across a single generation. The capture of the Persian royal family after the Battle of Issus in 333 BC provided Alexander with his most valuable prizes: the wife, mother, and daughters of King Darius III. How Alexander treated these ultimate Persian status symbols reveals the calculated nature of his exploitation. The Battle of Issus was catastrophic for Persia. King Darius III fled the battlefield, abandoning his entire family in the royal camp. Macedonian forces captured Queen Stara III, Darius's wife, Queen Mother Sisygambis, Darius's mother, and two daughters, including Princess Stara II. These were the highest-ranking women in the Persian Empire, and they were now Alexander's property. Alexander's treatment of the royal women was calculated propaganda. He ordered they be treated with respect, given comfortable quarters, allowed servants, maintained in something resembling their former status. Ancient historians celebrated this as proof of Alexander's nobility and restraint. But the respect was itself a form of control. The women were comfortable prisoners, their privileged captivity demonstrating Alexander's power to extend or withdraw mercy at will. Queen Mother Sisygambis became particularly useful to Alexander's propaganda. Ancient sources claim she came to view Alexander as a surrogate son, treating him with affection and eventually mourning his death. Whether this was genuine Stockholm Syndrome or performed survival strategy is debatable, but Alexander used it extensively. If even Persian royalty acknowledged his superiority, how could anyone question his right to rule Persia? The fate of Princess Statira II and her sister Drypades was more directly exploitative. Alexander kept them as hostages for years, using their captivity as leverage against their father Darius. When Darius was assassinated by his own generals in 330 BC, Alexander claimed to be avenging the Persian king while simultaneously arranging to marry his daughters, turning them from hostages into wives, from political prisoners into symbols of fusion. But calling these arrangements marriages obscures what they actually were. Statira and Drypades had no choice. They were captives being assigned to marry the man who'd conquered their civilization and led to their father's death. The weddings were political theater designed to legitimize Alexander's claim to the Persian throne by literally incorporating Persian royalty into his family. The sexual dimension was explicit, though ancient sources often euphemize it. Alexander took Statira as a wife while already married to Roxana of Bactria, another conquest marriage. He assigned Drypades to his closest companion Hephaestion. These weren't romantic relationships, they were transfers of valuable property, noble Persian women used to cement political alliances and demonstrate conquest completion. The psychological trauma on these women was profound but unrecorded. Ancient Greek and Macedonian sources focused on Alexander's magnanimity in treating them well, ignoring that good treatment for captives is still captivity. Statira and Drypades watched their civilization destroyed, their father killed, and themselves married to his conquerors. Whether they felt affection, resignation, or hidden hatred, no source cared to document. The Bactrian campaign, 329–327 BC, was among Alexander's most brutal, involving systematic pacification of mountainous territories in Central Asia. The treatment of Bactrian and Sogdian women during this campaign reveals conquest at its most violent and exploitative. Bactria and Sogdia, modern Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, resisted fiercely. Local populations were warrior societies who knew their terrain, conducted effective guerrilla warfare, and refused to submit even after major defeats. Alexander's frustration at this resistance manifested in increasingly brutal pacification tactics, mass executions, destruction of settlements, and systematic enslavement of populations. The capture of the Sogdian rock fortress in 327 BC demonstrated these tactics. The fortress was considered impregnable, built on a steep mountain with supplies for long siege. When Alexander's forces impossibly scaled the cliffs and captured it, the garrison surrendered expecting terms. Instead, Alexander ordered systematic enslavement of the entire population, approximately 30,000 people, mostly women and children, since fighting men had been killed during the assault. Among the captured was Roxana, daughter of Bactrian noble Oxyartes. Ancient sources describe her as extraordinarily beautiful, and Alexander immediately claimed her for himself. The subsequent marriage is portrayed in Greek sources as romantic, Alexander falling in love at first sight. The reality was more calculated. By marrying a Bactrian noble's daughter, Alexander aimed to pacify eastern provinces through alliance with local elites. But Roxana's marriage, however politically advantageous, was still fundamentally a conquest marriage. She was 14, Nitor's 16 years old when captured, while Alexander was 28. She'd witnessed her fortress stormed, her people enslaved, and herself claimed by the conquering king. Whether she later developed genuine affection for Alexander or simply performed the role expected for survival, her initial marriage was systematic exploitation of a teenage captive. The treatment of common Bactrian women was harsher. Thousands captured during the campaigns were distributed to Macedonian soldiers, sold to slave markets, or settled in military colonies Alexander established throughout the region. These colonies were designed to Hellenize Central Asia. Macedonian soldiers were given land and captive local women, expected to produce children who'd be raised Greek and maintain Macedonian control. The resistance to this systematic conquest was fierce. A Sogdian revolt in 329 BC involved mass killing of Macedonian garrison soldiers, including execution of officers who'd taken local women as concubines. This wasn't just military revolt, it was rejection of the sexual conquest that accompanied military conquest. Alexander's response was brutal suppression, mass executions, and renewed enslavement. The Bactrian campaign also involved the most extensive use of terror tactics. Alexander ordered mass crucifixions of rebels, public executions of local leaders, and systematic destruction of villages that resisted. Women from these destroyed communities became spoils, not just for soldiers' immediate use, but as long-term laborers in military colonies established to maintain control over conquered territories. The mass wedding at Susa in 324 BC has been celebrated by historians as Alexander's enlightened vision of unity between Greeks and Persians. Examining what actually happened reveals systematic exploitation disguised as multicultural ceremony. Alexander planned the event meticulously. He selected 10,000 of his Macedonian soldiers, not the entire army, but specific units that had distinguished themselves in campaigns. Each would receive a Persian wife, selected from noble families across the conquered empire. The weddings would occur simultaneously in an enormous ceremony demonstrating fusion of peoples. But how were these 10,000 Persian women selected? They were captives accumulated over years of conquest, held in various cities under Macedonian control, then transported to Susa specifically for this mass marriage. These weren't volunteers, they were prisoners being assigned to marry foreign soldiers. Refusal wasn't an option. Any woman who resisted was noted as rebellious and threatened with sale to brothels or execution. The preparation involved systematic cultural erasure. The Persian women were required to wear Greek-style wedding clothes, their traditional Persian garments forbidden. They were taught basic Greek phrases, their Persian language inadequate. They were instructed in Greek religious rituals, their Zoroastrian faith suppressed. Before the wedding even occurred, they'd undergone forced assimilation designed to erase their identities. The ceremony itself was massive propaganda. Alexander married Statira the Seed, daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis, daughter of previous Persian emperor, in elaborate rituals. His closest generals married other Persian noble women. Hephaestion married Drypetis, Statira's sister. Craterus married Darius's niece. Perdiccas married Atropates' daughter. These high-profile marriages established the template for the 10,000 mass marriages occurring simultaneously. The wedding rituals combined Greek and Persian elements, but the balance was calculated. Persian ceremonies were included enough to provide veneer of respect, but Greek elements dominated. The vows were spoken in Greek. The religious blessings were to Greek gods with Persian deities mentioned secondarily. The marriages were recorded in Greek legal documents that would govern the unions going forward. Alexander presented lavish gifts to celebrate, 10,000 talents distributed among the couples, debt forgiveness for soldiers, bonuses that made the event financially attractive to participants. But these inducements were necessary precisely because many soldiers didn't want Persian wives. They had Greek or Macedonian women back home or preferred to marry within their own culture. The gifts were bribes to participate in Alexander's social engineering. The aftermath revealed the true nature of these marriages. Within a year of Alexander's death in 323 BC, most Macedonian soldiers abandoned their Persian wives and returned to Greece. Ancient sources report that most of the 10,000 marriages dissolved immediately once Alexander's authority ended. The women were left in foreign lands with mixed children, abandoned by husbands who'd never wanted them in the first place. The children born from these brief unions faced identity crises, ethnically mixed but culturally neither Greek nor Persian. Most were raised by their abandoned Persian mothers, but in territories now controlled by Alexander's Greek successors. They existed in liminal space, never fully accepted by either culture, their existence proving not fusion, but the chaos created when systematic exploitation is disguised as enlightened policy. Beyond the public marriages, Alexander and his officers maintained extensive concubine systems that operated with the legal and moral framework of Macedonian military culture. Understanding this system reveals how systematic sexual exploitation was embedded in conquest itself. Macedonian tradition allowed commanders to take concubines from conquered populations. This was considered legitimate reward for military success. The concubines had no legal status as wives, but were property of their commanders, expected to provide sexual services and bear children. These children were legitimate in Macedonian law if acknowledged by fathers, creating incentive for commanders to maintain long-term concubine relationships. Alexander himself maintained multiple concubines alongside his official wives. Ancient sources mention Barsine, widow of a Greek mercenary commander, Campospe, a Greek courtesan, and unnamed Persian and Bactrian women taken during various campaigns. These women lived in the royal household, essentially a harem, expected to be available when Alexander wanted them, but otherwise living in relative luxury. The concubine system extended throughout the military hierarchy. Senior generals like Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Antigonus maintained households with multiple Persian concubines. Mid-ranking officers had one or two. Even common soldiers who'd served long enough might have a captive woman assigned semi-permanently rather than just temporary spoils. The army essentially traveled with thousands of enslaved women serving various capacities: concubines, servants, cooks, nurses, most captured during conquests. The treatment of these concubine women varied by individual commanders, but operated within systems that gave commanders absolute power. A concubine who pleased her commander might receive gifts, relative freedom within the household, and even manumission, freedom for herself or her children. A concubine who displeased might be beaten, given to someone else, sold to slave markets, or simply killed with no legal consequence. A Persian woman named Amestris experienced this system firsthand. Captured during the sack of Persepolis in 330 BC, at age 18, she was initially distributed to a common soldier, but her beauty attracted attention from a senior officer who purchased her. She became his concubine for 5 years, bearing 2 children. When the officer died during the Indian campaign in 326 BC, she and her children became property of his estate, eventually being given to another officer who already had 3 concubines. Her life was determined entirely by men's decisions, with her own preferences irrelevant. The concubine system also created hierarchies among enslaved women. Those who became long-term concubines to important commanders had higher status than women used by multiple soldiers or sold to brothels. This created competition and prevented solidarity. Women competed for better positions rather than uniting against the system. Some women betrayed others, reported escape plans, or sabotaged rivals, all seeking marginal improvements in impossible circumstances. The children born to concubines complicated the system further. If acknowledged by fathers, they were Macedonian citizens with inheritance rights, but acknowledgement was entirely at father's discretion. He could acknowledge or reject based on whim. Many children of concubines grew up in liminal status, ethnically mixed, legally uncertain, culturally confused about identity. Alexander encouraged his commanders to take Persian concubines as part of his fusion policy. He believed that by creating personal relationships, however exploitative, between Macedonians and Persians, he'd make conquest permanent. Commanders who embraced this policy received favor, while those who didn't faced criticism for not fully supporting the king's vision. The systematic enslavement of Persian women operated at scale far beyond high-profile royal marriages or officers' concubines. Tens of thousands of common women were captured, enslaved, and distributed throughout Alexander's expanding empire in ways that fundamentally reshaped demographics. Every major siege resulted in mass enslavements. When Gaza fell in 332 BC, after brutal 2-month siege, approximately 10,000 people were enslaved, mostly women and children. When Persepolis was sacked in 330 BC, ancient sources suggest 30,000 Memmias, 50,000 people from the city and surrounding areas were enslaved. The Indian campaign in 327 Memmias 325 BC involved enslavement of entire populations from captured cities. Sources mention 80,000 captives from just one campaign season. The logistics of enslaving tens of thousands required sophisticated infrastructure. Macedonian armies traveled with slave merchants who followed campaigns specifically to purchase captured populations. These merchants provided immediate cash to the army, important for payroll and supplies, while taking responsibility for transporting enslaved people to markets throughout the Greek world. The slave markets were distributed across Alexander's empire and beyond. Major markets operated in Athens, Corinth, Rhodes, Alexandria after its founding, Babylon, and Susa. Smaller regional markets existed throughout Asia Minor and the Greek mainland. Persian women captured during Alexander's campaigns flowed into all these markets, being purchased by buyers seeking domestic servants, agricultural workers, or sexual slaves. The prices varied based on age, appearance, skills, and market conditions. A beautiful young Persian woman might sell for 500, 800 drachmas in peak markets. A common woman past prime childbearing years might bring only 150, 200 drachmas. Children were valued for future potential. A healthy 10-year-old girl might sell for 300 drachmas in anticipation of her maturing into prime working or reproductive age. The transportation of enslaved women was brutal and deliberately designed to break spirits. They were marched in chains, given minimal food and water, subjected to sexual violence during transport, and kept in conditions that maximized control while minimizing escape opportunities. Mortality during transport was significant, Perhaps 10 to 20% of captives died before reaching final markets, but accepted as business cost by both army and merchants. A Sogdian woman named Apama survived this system. Captured during the Bactrian campaign at age 16, she was marched 2,000 miles to Susa, sold to a Greek merchant, transported to Athens, and eventually purchased by a wealthy Athenian household. The journey took 8 months, during which she witnessed dozens of women die from exhaustion, disease, or despair. She survived by becoming invisible, complying with every order, never resisting, training herself to feel nothing. The mass enslavements also disrupted Persian demographic structures. Entire regions lost significant percentages of their female populations. Young women of childbearing age systematically removed and distributed throughout Alexander's empire. This created gender imbalances that affected Persian population recovery for generations. Some areas never recovered demographically from systematic population extraction during Alexander's conquests. Alexander's fusion policy required producing children who'd blend Greek and Persian bloodlines, creating a hybrid population that would stabilize his empire. This meant systematically breeding captured Persian women with Macedonian men in ways that were carefully planned and executed. The mass marriages at Susa were the most visible component, but the breeding program operated at all levels of the army. Macedonian soldiers were actively encouraged to take Persian women as wives or concubines and produce children. These children would be raised Macedonian, speaking Greek, worshiping Greek gods, trained in Macedonian military traditions, but their Persian physical features and partial heritage would make them acceptable to Persian populations. The legal framework supported this program. Children born to Persian slave women from Macedonian fathers were legally Macedonian if the father acknowledged paternity. This acknowledgement wasn't automatic, it was father's choice, but military commanders encouraged acknowledgement as part of building a loyal hybrid population. Acknowledged children inherited property rights, could join the army, and were considered Macedonian citizens despite mother's enslaved status. The children themselves existed in complicated identity spaces. Ethnically mixed, but culturally raised Greek, they often faced discrimination from both pure Greeks, who saw them as bastards or half-barbarians, and Persians, who saw them as products of conquest. But Alexander and his successors valued them precisely for this mixed status. They could serve as intermediaries, translators, administrators who understood both cultures. A woman named Artonis bore 3 children to a Macedonian officer over 7 years. All 3 were acknowledged by their father and raised in his household alongside children from his Greek wife. The mixed children had lower status than legitimate children, but higher status than enslaved people. When their father died, his Greek widow inherited the estate, and she immediately sold Artonis, still enslaved, but kept the mixed children. They were Macedonian by law, even though their mother wasn't. The scale of this breeding program was substantial. If 10,000 Macedonian soldiers received Persian wives at Susa alone, and each couple produced 3-5 children over their lifetimes, that's 30,000, 50,000 mixed children from just one event. Multiply this by 11 years of campaigning, with soldiers taking concubines and distributing captured women throughout the army, and the total probably reaches 100,000 mixed children born during and shortly after Alexander's conquests. These children became the foundation for the Hellenistic world, the Greek-Persian hybrid civilization that emerged in the successor kingdoms after Alexander's death. The Ptolemies in Egypt, Seleucids in Syria and Mesopotamia, and Greco-Bactrian kingdoms in Central Asia all governed populations that were increasingly mixed through systematic breeding programs Alexander initiated, but the program's success came at enormous human cost. The Persian mothers had no choice about bearing children, no control over how those children were raised, and no legal rights to their own offspring. They watched their children become Greek while being forbidden from teaching them Persian language, religion, or culture. The systematic erasure happened generationally. Grandchildren of captured Persian women often knew nothing about their grandmother's origins, except that they'd been captured during Alexander's campaigns. Despite overwhelming power imbalances, Persian women developed forms of resistance to systematic exploitation. Most resistance was subtle, small acts of defiance that didn't invite death but preserved some fragment of dignity. But occasionally, resistance was violent and spectacular. The most common form of resistance was cultural preservation. Persian mothers teaching daughters words in Persian language, singing old songs when guards weren't listening, telling stories about Persian gods and heroes. These acts were dangerous. If discovered, they marked you as resistant to assimilation and could result in punishment. But many women took the risk, determined to pass something of their heritage to next generation. Some women resisted through refusal of maternal role. Infanticide of mixed children was rare but not unknown. A woman might kill her newborn rather than raise another child for her rapist. This was extraordinarily dangerous, destroying master's property, and usually resulted in brutal execution if discovered. But it represented ultimate refusal of the breeding system. Suicide was another form of resistance. Ancient sources mention Persian women killing themselves rather than submitting to sexual enslavement, throwing themselves from walls during sieges, consuming poison, or drowning themselves. These acts were interpreted by Greek historians as barbarian emotionalism rather than rational rejection of intolerable circumstances, but they represented real choices to die free rather than live enslaved. Collective resistance occurred rarely but spectacularly. During the Bactrian Revolt in 329 BC, local women participated in killing Macedonian garrison soldiers. Ancient sources describe women using cooking knives and household implements as weapons, suggesting they'd been waiting for opportunity to strike back. The revolt was crushed brutally, but the participation of enslaved women demonstrated that compliance didn't mean acceptance. A Persian noblewoman named Barsine, different from Alexander's concubine of the same name, led a small group of enslaved women in an escape attempt during the Indian campaign in 326 BC. They stole horses and supplies, fled into the night, and attempted to reach Persian-controlled territories. They were recaptured after 3 days. The Indian landscape was unfamiliar, they couldn't speak local languages, and Macedonian cavalry easily tracked them. The execution was public and brutal. They were crucified as warning to other captive women, but the attempt itself represented extraordinary courage in circumstances designed to make resistance impossible. Some resistance took the form of selective compliance. Women might sexually comply to survive while secretly maintaining Persian identity, teaching children Persian in private, observing Zoroastrian rituals covertly, and preserving cultural knowledge underground. This dual existence required constant vigilance and psychological compartmentalization, appearing Greek publicly while remaining Persian privately. The most effective resistance, though least visible, was the cultural transmission that occurred despite systematic suppression. Even in the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged after Alexander's death, Persian cultural elements persisted: architectural styles, religious practices, administrative traditions. This persistence owed much to Persian women who'd transmitted knowledge to children, despite official policies demanding complete Hellenization. Alexander died in Babylon in June 323 BC at age 32, triggering immediate crisis in his empire and specifically affecting thousands of Persian women bound to Macedonian men through conquest marriages and systematic exploitation. The mass marriages dissolved almost immediately. Ancient sources report that most of the 10,000 soldiers who'd married Persian women at Susa abandoned their wives and returned to Greece within months of Alexander's death. They'd participated in the mass wedding only because Alexander commanded it and provided financial incentives. Without his authority, they saw no reason to maintain marriages to foreign women they'd never chosen. The abandoned women faced desperate circumstances. They were far from their original homes, often with young children from brief unions, in territories dissolving into civil war as Alexander's generals fought for succession. They had no legal standing, no resources, no family to return to. Many ended up in slave markets again, sold by Macedonian soldiers, cleaning up estates before returning home. Others survived through prostitution, domestic servitude, or attaching themselves to new Macedonian masters in successor kingdoms. Princess Stayra II, Alexander's Persian widow, and her sister Drypetis suffered particularly cruel fates. Within weeks of Alexander's death, they were murdered by Roxana, Alexander's Bactrian widow, who saw them as threats to her son's succession claims. The murders demonstrated how Persian royal women who'd survived the conquest itself became pawns in Macedonian power struggles, their lives ultimately expendable. The concubines maintained by Alexander and his generals faced similar uncertainties. When commanders died or returned to Greece, their Persian concubines became property of their estates, to be sold, given away, or simply abandoned. A few fortunate ones had borne acknowledged sons who might provide some protection, but most faced renewed vulnerability. Queen Mother Sisygambis, who'd lived comfortably under Alexander's protection, reportedly died of grief within weeks of learning about his death. Whether this was genuine emotional devastation or resignation that her protected status had ended with her protector, the result was the same. She didn't survive to see what happened to the hybrid empire Alexander had tried to create. The successor kingdoms that emerged from decades of warfare, Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Syria, Greco-Bactrian kingdoms, all maintained elements of Alexander's fusion policy, but with significant differences. The Ptolemies in Egypt intermarried extensively with local populations, creating genuinely mixed dynasty. The Seleucids maintained Persian administrative structures while imposing Greek language and culture. The Greco-Bactrian kingdoms in Central Asia became most thoroughly mixed, producing cultures that blended Greek, Persian, and Central Asian elements almost equally. These successor kingdoms also inherited tens of thousands of children born from Alexander-era systematic breeding. These mixed children grew up during the wars of the successors 323-281 BC often witnessing renewed violence and eventually becoming foundation for Hellenistic civilization. But their mothers, the Persian women who'd borne them, largely disappeared from historical records, their stories unimportant to historians writing about great men and their kingdoms. The demographic impact of Alexander's 11-year campaign persisted across generations. Genetic studies of modern populations in former Persian territories show elevated frequencies of European genetic markers introduced during this period. The systematic breeding had lasting biological effects visible today in DNA of millions of descendants who don't know their ancestry traces, partly to captured Persian women who bore children to Macedonian conquerors 2,300 years ago. The systematic destruction of Persian cultural identity among captured women and their children was as calculated as military conquest itself, designed to erase Persia across generations while preserving Persian bodies to serve Macedonian interests. Language erasure began immediately upon capture. Persian women were forbidden from speaking Persian in most Macedonian-controlled contexts. They had to learn Greek quickly to understand commands, serve effectively, and avoid punishment for incomprehension. Within a few years, most spoke primarily Greek, even with other Persians, because it was safer and more practical. Their native tongues became secret languages, spoken only in whispers. The children born to captured women represented complete linguistic erasure. They were raised speaking Greek as their first language. Persian was forbidden or unknown to them. By age 5, 6, these children spoke only Greek, thought in Greek, and had no access to their mother's language, except perhaps a few words learned secretly. By the second generation, Persian linguistic heritage was almost entirely destroyed among diaspora populations scattered across the Hellenistic world. Religious conversion was forced comprehensively. Persia was predominantly Zoroastrian before conquest, with religious practices central to Persian identity. Macedonian authorities required captured women to participate in Greek religious ceremonies, making offerings to Zeus, Athena, Dionysus, gods they didn't believe in. Secret Zoroastrian practice was dangerous. If discovered, it marked you as resistant to assimilation and invited punishment. The children faced even more complete religious erasure. They were raised worshiping Greek gods, participating in Greek festivals, learning Greek mythology as their spiritual framework. Most never learned about Ahura Mazda or Zoroastrian cosmology, except perhaps fragments their mothers whispered. By adulthood, these children were functionally Greek in religious identity, their Persian heritage reduced to vague awareness that their mothers came from somewhere else. Names were changed systematically. A woman born Artonis became Artemisia. Roxana became acceptable only because it sounded vaguely Greek. Statera was kept only for royalty, whose Persian names carried political value. Common women received Greek names, Thais, Phryne, Callias, erasing their identities with each utterance of these foreign names. Over time, they internalized these names, sometimes forgetting their birth names entirely. Clothing and appearance were forcibly Hellenized. Persian dress, distinctive flowing robes, elaborate jewelry, specific hairstyles marking status and region, was replaced by Greek styles. Women wore Greek chitones and peplos, arranged their hair in Greek fashions, adopted Greek cosmetics and ornaments. Within months of capture, they looked Greek in appearance. their Persian origins visible only in facial features or skin tones that marked them as foreign-born. Food culture changed completely. Persian cuisine, rich with rice, saffron, pomegranates, specific spices and preparation methods, was replaced by Greek diets heavy in wheat, olive oil, wine, and different flavor profiles. Women working as cooks learned Greek recipes. Within a generation, their descendants ate Greek food exclusively, never tasting the dishes their grandmothers had known. The culinary heritage erased, along with language and religion. Social customs and behaviors were systematically replaced. Persian gender roles, marriage customs, childbearing practices, mourning rituals, all were overwritten by Greek expectations. Captured women learned to behave as Greek women, adopting submissive postures appropriate to Greek gender hierarchies, learning Greek domestic skills, performing Greek social roles. Their Persian customs for major life events, births, coming of age, deaths, were replaced or forbidden. The erasure accelerated across generations. A woman captured at age 20 might maintain internal sense of Persian identity throughout her life, despite outward assimilation. But her children, born into captivity, learned almost nothing of Persia except stories their mother told in whispers. These second-generation descendants spoke only Greek, worshipped Greek gods, wore Greek clothes, ate Greek food. They were ethnically Persian, but culturally entirely Greek. By the third generation, connection to Persian heritage was essentially lost. Grandchildren of captured women knew their physical features came from somewhere in Persia, but they had no knowledge of languages, customs, religions, or practices that had defined their grandmothers' identities. The systematic cultural genocide was complete. They looked different, but thought and acted as Greeks. Some women tried desperately to preserve fragments. They taught children Persian words in secret, sang old songs when no one listened, told stories about Persian heroes and Zoroastrian teachings. These acts of cultural resistance were dangerous but psychologically necessary. They represented refusal to be completely erased. But fragments whispered in corners couldn't sustain culture across generations against overwhelming Greek pressure. The cultural erasure served practical purposes beyond ideology. Captured women who retained strong Persian identity were more likely to resist, attempt escape, maintain loyalties to something beyond their captors. Breaking cultural identity made women more compliant, more dependent on Greek systems, more willing to accept their status because they had nowhere else to belong culturally or psychologically. The economic scale of Alexander's systematic exploitation of Persian women was substantial, operating across 11 years of conquest and involving tens of thousands of women whose bodies became commodities in Macedonian military economy. Conservative estimates based on ancient sources and modern demographic analysis suggest Alexander's campaigns captured 50,000, 100,000 Persian women from all social classes. This includes women from major sieges, Tyre 8,000 minus 10,000, Gaza 5,000 minus 10,000, Persepolis 20,000 30,000, systematic enslavement during Bactrian campaigns 30,000 40,000, and ongoing smaller captures throughout the 11-year conquest. The economic value was enormous. At average market prices of 300 minus 600 drachmas per woman, varying by age, appearance, and skills, the total value of captured women reached approximately 20,000 40,000 talents. To contextualize, This was equivalent to perhaps 5 to 10 years of the entire Athenian state budget at its height, or enough to pay Alexander's entire army for 2 to 3 years of campaigning. The distribution systems were sophisticated. High-value captives, royal women, exceptional beauties, highly skilled, were reserved for Alexander's personal distribution. He used them as diplomatic gifts, rewards for loyal generals, or kept them himself. Mid-value captives were distributed to officers based on rank and merit. Common captives were divided among soldiers based on unit contributions to victories. But significant portions of captured women were also sold for immediate cash. Alexander's army required constant funding for supplies, equipment, and soldier pay. Slave merchants traveled with the army specifically to purchase captives, providing immediate liquidity. These merchants then transported women to markets throughout the Greek world, where they were resold at profit. The slave markets that processed these women operated across the Mediterranean and Near East. Major markets in Athens, Corinth, Rhodes, and Ephesus saw constant influx of Persian captives during Alexander's campaigns. New markets emerged in Alexandria, founded 331 BC, and other cities Alexander established. The scale was such that it temporarily affected regional slave prices. When Tyre's 30,000 captives flooded markets, prices dropped due to oversupply. The breeding component multiplied economic value. A captured woman worth 400 drachmas who bore 4 children over her lifetime created perhaps 1,200, 1,600 drachmas total value, assuming children worth 300, 400 drachmas by working age. Across tens of thousands of women over 2 generations, the economic return from breeding far exceeded initial capture value. The infrastructure supporting this systematic exploitation employed thousands. Slave merchants who followed the army, market operators who processed captives, transport specialists who moved people across vast distances, guards who prevented escapes, scribes who documented transactions. The entire system was a significant economic sector, generating employment and profit for Greek participants. A Persian woman named Atosa's story illustrates the economics. Captured at age 19 during the Persepolis sack, she was initially valued at 500 drachmas due to her beauty and noble background. Sold to a merchant, transported to Athens, she was resold for 700 drachmas to a wealthy household. Over the next 12 years, she bore 3 children, adding 900 drachmas value to her owner's household, trained as a skilled weaver, increasing her own value to perhaps 800 drachmas, and eventually was sold again at age 31 for 650 drachmas when her owner needed cash. Her total economic impact across her lifetime was approximately 2,800 drachmas, nearly 7 times her initial capture value. The taxation of this trade generated substantial revenue for various authorities. Markets collected fees on transactions, typically 2 to 5% of sale price. These fees funded market operations and provided revenue to controlling governments. Over 11 years of intensive slave trading from Alexander's campaigns, total tax revenue from Persian captive sales probably reached 500 minders 1,000 talents. The economic dependency this created was significant. Portions of the Greek economy came to rely on steady supply of enslaved people from Eastern conquests. When Alexander's campaigns ended with his death in 323 BC and the supply of fresh captives declined, it created economic adjustments throughout the slave markets. Prices rose, alternative sources were sought, and the economic impact of systematic exploitation became visible through its absence. Modern genetic studies provide scientific confirmation of Alexander's systematic exploitation, revealing biological evidence that persists in contemporary populations and quantifying demographic impact across 2,300 years. DNA research in former Persian territories shows elevated frequencies of European genetic markers introduced during the Hellenistic period. Populations in Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia show 5 to 15% European ancestry on maternal lines. Mitochondrial DNA inherited through mothers that dates to approximately 300 BC, precisely when Alexander's campaigns systematically captured and bred Persian women with Macedonian soldiers. The pattern is revealing. European maternal genetic markers appear at significant frequencies, but European paternal markers, Y chromosome DNA inherited through fathers, appear at much lower frequencies. This asymmetry indicates gene flow occurred primarily through European men having children with local women, exactly what systematic capture and breeding programs produce. Studies of ancient DNA from Hellenistic period burial sites confirm this pattern. Skeletal remains from Greek colonies in Bactria and Sogdia show individuals with mixed European and Central Asian ancestry, with maternal lineages predominantly local and paternal lineages predominantly Greek. These are the children and grandchildren of the systematic breeding Alexander initiated. One particularly striking study analyzed DNA from a Hellenistic burial site in Afghanistan. Multiple individuals showed classic genetic mixing patterns: European paternal lineages, Central Asian maternal lineages, physical features intermediate between the two populations. These were exactly the hybrid population Alexander intended to create, and they existed in substantial numbers across territories he conquered. The genetic evidence also reveals information historical records don't provide. DNA from teeth can determine where individuals were born based on chemical signatures absorbed during childhood. Studies found that significant percentages of women buried in Hellenistic Greek colonies in Central Asia were born elsewhere. Their tooth chemistry indicates childhoods in Western Persia or Mesopotamia. These women were likely captured in Western campaigns, transported thousands of miles east, and died in Greek military colonies far from birthplaces. Modern populations carry this legacy in their DNA. Genetic studies estimate that 10 to 20% of populations in former Persian territories have some ancestry tracing to the Hellenistic mixing period. This represents millions of living people descended partly from Persian women captured during Alexander's campaigns and the Macedonian soldiers who fathered their children. The research has also identified specific genetic markers associated with this mixing. Certain European mitochondrial haplogroups, like H, J, and T, appear in Central Asian and Iranian populations at frequencies explainable only through significant gene flow during the Hellenistic period. These markers trace directly to Greek and Macedonian women or to Persian women who bore children to Greek men during the post-conquest period. Persian populations show the clearest evidence. Iran today has approximately 8 to 12% European maternal ancestry, most dating to the Hellenistic and subsequent periods. Afghanistan shows 10 to 15%. Pakistan's northern regions show 5 to 10%. These percentages represent biological evidence of systematic capture and breeding across territories Alexander conquered. The genetic legacy extends to psychological and cultural implications. Discovering that ancestors were systematically captured creates complex emotional responses for modern descendants. Some Iranian and Afghan citizens researching family histories have discovered Greek maternal lineages entering their families 2,300 years ago through captured ancestors, forcing confrontation with uncomfortable historical truths. The systematic exploitation of Persian women by Alexander has been minimized, romanticized, or entirely erased from popular historical narratives that celebrate him as Alexander the Great and portray his conquests as bringing civilization to barbarism. The traditional narrative emphasizes Alexander's military genius, his cultural openness, his vision of unity between Greeks and Persians. The Susa mass wedding is presented as evidence of his enlightened multiculturalism. His marriages to Roxana and Statira are portrayed as romantic unions, showing his respect for Persian culture. The entire conquest is framed as liberation and civilization rather than systematic violence and exploitation. This narrative, sanitization, serves multiple purposes. It allows Western civilization to celebrate a foundational figure without confronting uncomfortable truths about systematic sexual violence. It perpetuates the myth of benevolent conquest, where superior civilizations improve inferior ones through force. It treats women as invisible or marginal to conquest rather than fundamental to how conquest actually operated. The ancient sources themselves contributed to this sanitization. Greek and Roman historians, writing about Alexander, were almost universally adulatory, celebrating his achievements while minimizing or justifying his brutalities. They described captured Persian women as prizes or spoils rather than victims of systematic exploitation. They portrayed the mass wedding as Alexander's generosity rather than forced assimilation. They focused on male generals and battles while treating women as background scenery. Modern popular culture continues this pattern. Films like Alexander 2004 include the romance with Roxana, but obscure that she was a 14-year-old captive when married to a 28-year-old conqueror. Historical documentaries celebrate his military tactics while spending minimal time on systematic enslavement of populations. Museums display artifacts from his conquests without adequately contextualizing the human cost of acquiring those artifacts. Academic historiography has been slow to center women's experiences in Alexander narratives. Until recently, most scholarly work focused on military campaigns, political strategy, and cultural impacts, while treating women as marginal. When women appeared, they were typically royal figures like Olympias, Alexander's mother, or Roxana, not the tens of thousands of common women systematically exploited during conquest. This is changing. Recent scholarship has begun examining conquest through gendered lens, analyzing how systematic sexual violence was integral to Alexander's campaigns rather than incidental. Researchers are documenting the scale of enslavement, the breeding programs, the cultural erasure, and the generational impacts on Persian populations. But this scholarship remains largely academic, not yet fully integrated into popular understanding of Alexander. The contrast between Persian and Greek historical memory is stark. Greek sources celebrated Alexander as hero and world conqueror. Persian sources that survived portray him as destroyer. The Shahnameh Persian epic calls him Alexander the Accursed, who destroyed Persian civilization. This difference reflects whose perspective shaped historical memory: conquerors celebrating their victories versus conquered peoples remembering their devastation. The women themselves left almost no direct testimony. They couldn't write histories. Greek and Macedonian writers didn't consider their perspectives worth recording. Persian sources focused on male rulers and military resistance. The systematic exclusion of women's voices from historical records was itself part of the exploitation. They were so thoroughly dehumanized that their experiences seemed unworthy of documentation, but they existed. Each mass enslavement documented in ancient sources: 30,000 people enslaved at Tyre, 50,000 captives from Persepolis, represented tens of thousands of individual women with names, families, identities that were systematically destroyed. Each genetic marker in modern populations represents a woman whose body became a tool of demographic conquest 2,300 years ago. The silence in historical records is itself evidence. Romans documented everything: military campaigns, construction projects, laws, commercial transactions, but women captured during conquests appear only as property statistics or brief mentions. This absence isn't accidental. It reflects systematic dehumanization, where women's experiences weren't considered worth recording because they weren't seen as fully human. Princess Statira II, forced to marry her father's killer, murdered by Roxana within weeks of Alexander's death. Roxana of Bactria, captured at 14, married to her conqueror, who eventually ordered her and her son executed by Alexander's successors. Atossa of Persepolis, captured at 19, sold 3 times, bore 3 children, raised Greek while forbidden from teaching them Persian. Amastris the concubine, passed between officers like property for 8 years before being abandoned when her last owner died. Apama of Sogdia marched 2,000 miles in chains, who survived by feeling nothing. Remember them. Remember the 50,000, 100,000 Persian women captured across 11 years. Remember their children raised Greek while mothers whispered forbidden Persian words. Remember the genetic evidence in DNA of millions carrying maternal ancestry from women whose names are lost forever. The Macedonian phalanx was military innovation. Alexandria's library was intellectual achievement. The Hellenistic kingdoms were cultural synthesis, but these accomplishments were built on systematic sexual slavery of conquered women. History demands complete accounting, not just celebrating achievements, but acknowledging the violence that made those achievements possible. These women's bodies built the Hellenistic world as surely as Alexander's tactics and Philip's phalanx. They deserve more than erasure from narratives celebrating their conquerors. They deserve recognition that their suffering enabled everything Alexander accomplished. They deserve remembrance as human beings who endured systematic exploitation with whatever strength they could find. The ruins of Persepolis still stand, tourists photographing ancient columns, while guides explain Alexander's strategic genius. Few markers acknowledge the 30,000–50,000 women captured when the city fell. The stones remember. The silence is our choice. Remember them.